Springsteen sound.
Is that it? Is it showtime?
I think it's
Showtime.
Yeah.
Right. So we'll mute everyone.
Mute everyone. Mute.
Yep. Welcome to the third Wednesday Vesper service of UMIAC, the UU Multiracial Unity Action Council. Tonight, the sermon is called The Making of Frederick Douglass. It's about his time as a slave and the first 7 years of his freedom. And it's at the end of that time that he had fully become the Frederick Douglass we read about in history books. I'm the preacher. I'm a semi-retired UU minister living in Massachusetts. I'm active in my local church, and this year I'm the chair of the board of directors of UMIAC. Our next service on March 15th will be by Dr. Matthew Shear, who's a behavioral optometrist, which is a very interesting thing. His service is going to be called I Know There's an Answer, but with "an" emphasized. I know there's an answer. There's an answer to the questions life gives us in our liberal religion, in our principles and sources and practices. I know there's an answer. If you got a link for this service from that email, Richard 3-Point, you'll get one automatically for the next service unless you opt out. If you got the link for this forwarded to you by someone else, though, you may not have it forwarded next time, in which case you might want to send an email to that address and I'll add you to the list. All of our past services are on YouTube. If you go to our homepage, uumuac.org, and scroll down, there'll be a link for the third Wednesday services. In just 3 days, this Saturday, we're holding a conference, convocation we're calling it, called Repairing the UUA's Approach to Racial Justice. It'll last about 2.5 hours. There'll be 6 speakers. There'll be a break in the middle where you can go to the bathroom or grab a sandwich. It starts at 11 o'clock Central Time, Eastern Time at noon, and you can see 10 Mountain, 9 Pacific. To register for this, there's no cost for this. We just would like you to tell us you're coming. Send an email not to this Richard 3-Point address, but rather to the address you see there, umiac@gmail.com. And the day before, on Friday, you'll get the Zoom information you need to join. We gather this hour as people of faith, having sorrows and joys and needs and gifts. We light this beacon of hope as a sign of our quest for truth and meaning, and in celebration of the life we share together. I'd like to begin with a little music. This is Duke Ellington's beautiful Come Sunday. It's number 202 in the Gray Hymnal, and the performers are the Chancel Choir of the First Unitarian Church in Oakland, California.
Sunday,
It is the mission of the Unitarian Universalist Multiracial Unity Action Council to carry out and foster anti-racist and multicultural unity activities both within and outside the Unitarian Universalist Association through education, bearing witness and other actions, and expansion of our membership both within and outside the walls of our congregations. We also seek to defend our UU principles against those who seek to undermine them. We envision our congregations, denomination, and society as not being color blind, but color appreciative, as judging and treating members of the world's rank and file by the content of their character, not the color of their skin or their cultural heritage, and as treasuring diversity in the context of the beloved community. We call this vision multiracial Unitarian Universalism. This is the prize on which we try to keep our eyes. This is the goal. This is the mountaintop, the unity of the light and dark-skinned people of the world. For a reading tonight, I'd like to read part of Frederick Douglass's speech entitled "A Plea for Freedom of Speech in Boston." This is a speech he delivered on the 9th of December in 1860, right on the threshold of the Civil War. He was at the height of his powers. He was 42 years old. Kate Rohde, at her October
third Wednesday service, read the entire speech. I'm not reading the entire speech, just excerpts. And as I do, of course, I'm thinking to myself, take this, national UU officials, because the national UU officials at the moment are, to make a long story short, claiming that to reduce racism, it's necessary to suppress speech. And here's one of the greatest anti-racism fighters our nation has ever seen, saying exactly the opposite, and saying so in Boston. In Boston. So here is Frederick Douglass. We thought the principle of free speech was an accomplished fact. Here in Boston, if nowhere else, we thought the right of the people to assemble and to express their opinion was secure. Dr. Channing, that was the Unitarian leader, Dr. Channing had defended the right. Mr. Garrison, the abolitionist, Mr. Garrison had asserted the right, and Theodore Parker had maintained it with steadiness and fidelity to the last. And there he's referring to the fact that Unitarian minister Theodore Parker had just died a few months earlier. But here we are today contending for what we thought we gained years ago. Last Monday, a meeting assembled to discuss the question, how shall slavery be abolished? The world knows that that meeting was invaded, insulted, and captured by a mob, not of ruffians, but of gentlemen, and thereafter broken up and dispersed by the order of the mayor, who refused to protect the meeting, though called upon to do so. The leaders of the mob, I say, were gentlemen. They were men who pride themselves upon their respect for law and order. These gentlemen brought their respect for the law with them and proclaimed it loudly while in the very act of breaking the law. Theirs was actually the law of slavery, the law of free speech, and the law for the protection of public meetings they trampled underfoot, while they greatly magnified the law of slavery. No right was deemed by the fathers of our government more sacred than the right of speech. It was, in their eyes, as in the eyes of all thoughtful men, the great moral renovator of society and government. Daniel Webster, a congressman from New Hampshire, then senator from Massachusetts, called it a homebred right, a fireside privilege. Liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. That of all rights is the dread of tyrants. It is the right which they first of all strike down. They know its power. We are told by officials that the meeting was ill-timed and the parties to it unwise. Has Boston yet to learn that the time to assert a right is the time when the right itself is called in question, and that the men of all others to assert it are the men to whom the right has been denied? There can be no right of speech where any man, however lifted up or however humble, however young or however old, is overawed by force and compelled to suppress his honest sentiments. Equally clear is the right to hear. To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. It is just as criminal to rob a man of his right to speak or hear as it would be to rob him of his money. I have no doubt that Boston will vindicate this right, but in order to do so, there must be no concessions to the enemy. When a man is allowed to speak because he is rich and powerful, it aggravates the crime of denying the right to the poor and humble. The principle must rest upon its own proper basis, and until the right is accorded to the humblest as freely as to the most exalted citizen, the government of Boston is but an empty name and its freedom a mockery. A man's right to speak does not depend upon where he was born or upon his color. The simple quality of manhood is the solid basis of the right, and there let it rest forever. I have a short prayer tonight I would like to share. It's by Vivian Pomeroy, who was a man. He was the minister of the First Church in Boston for quite a while, back in the 40s. Could we please be joined in a spirit of prayer or meditation? May we be forgiven that often we excuse ourselves so easily and others so reluctantly. May we be forgiven that we expect perfection from those to whom we show far less. Forgive us for repelling people by the way we set a good example for them. May we be forgiven the folly of trying to improve our friends. May we be forgiven that we sometimes use our little idea of goodness as a spear to wound others who are different. May we be forgiven when we feel superior to others, when we are only more shielded and better defended. And may we encourage the secret struggle of every person. May we encourage the secret struggle of every person. Amen. And now let us be silent together to create an opportunity for prayer or meditation. Sing along if you like, but please stay muted. The Zoom technology can't cope with sound from even two windows at the same time. Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me. There he is. He's about 25 years old, maybe 27. Tonight I'm talking about him from his time of slavery, which ended when he was 20, until he was 27. And he's probably 25 or 26, something like that, in this picture. He was a striking man. They say he was the most photographed man of the 19th century. He was half African, half European in heritage. His mother was Helen Bailey, and he was born Frederick Bailey, and his father was her owner. His first wife was a black woman. After a 44-year marriage, she died, and he married a white woman, and he was criticized, and he said, well, my first wife was the color of my mother, and my second wife was the color of my father. What's your problem? He was more than 6 feet tall. And at the time he lived, in the 19th century, the average man was about as tall as I am, which is 5'5". He was over 6 feet. He was a striking man in person. They say no one who ever heard him speak ever forgot it. His life in outline was he was born a slave. At age 20, he escaped. He became a speaker in the abolitionist cause, and then later in other social justice causes. He became a newspaper editor, an author, a publisher. At the end of his life, he moved to Washington, D.C. and became a civil official in the city government. And at the very end of his life, he was a diplomat representing the United States in Haiti. He's a hero of mine for 3 reasons. First, because of his accomplishments. Secondly, because of the keenness of his mind. And thirdly, because of the depth of his character. And I'll take those up one at a time. He was born, as I said, Frederick Bailey, in a plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland. And I think the eastern shore of Maryland means on the eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay. He was born sometime in February of 1818, of 1818, though he thought he was born in 1817. And his confusion about his birth year is a result of this. He may have seen his mother fairly frequently when he was an infant, but by the time he was old enough to remember seeing her, he hardly ever saw her. I'm reading a passage from he wrote 3 autobiographies, and I'm reading a passage from the first one, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. He published this in 1845 when he was 27. I never saw my mother, to know her as such, more than 4 or 5 times in my life. And each of those times was very short in duration, and at night. She was hired by a Mr. Stewart who lived about 12 miles from my home. She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot after the performance of her day's work. She was a field hand. I do not recollect of ever seeing my mother by the light of day. She was with me in the night. She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but before I waked, she was gone. Very little communication ever took place between us. Death soon ended what little we could have while she lived, and with it her hardships and suffering. She died when I was about 7 years old. When he was 4 or 5 or 6, he asked her how old he was, and she estimated that he had been born in 1818. But historians now know that he was, um, excuse me, his mother said he was born in 1817. Sorry. Historians now know it was really 1818. So he spent his whole life thinking he was a year older than he really was. He lived to be 77. He thought he lived to be 78. And his mother remembered that he was born in February but couldn't remember the day. So he chose Valentine's Day to be his birthday. He stayed at that plantation until the age of 8. And here's an account of what it was like as a child on that plantation. I suffered much from hunger, but much more from cold. In hottest summer and coldest winter, I was kept almost naked. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing but a coarse linen shirt which reached only to my knees. I had no bed. I must have perished with cold, but that, the coldest nights, I used to steal a bag which was used for carrying corn to the mill. I would crawl into the bag and there sleep on the cold, damp clay floor with my head in the bag and my feet out. My feet have been so cracked with the frost that the pen with which I'm writing now might be laid in the gashes in my feet. We were not regularly allowanced. Our food was coarse cornmeal boiled. This was called mush. It was put into a large wooden tray or trough and set down upon the ground. The children were then called like so many pigs, and like so many pigs they would come and devour the mush, some with oyster shells, others with pieces of shingle, some with naked hands, none with spoons. He that ate the fastest got most. He that was strongest secured the best place, and few left the trough satisfied. At age 8, he had the good luck to be loaned to a friend of his owner who lived in Baltimore and who needed help. And at this home in Baltimore, things were very different for Frederick. He had the first meal of his life at a table. He slept in a bed for the first time in his life. And it was there he learned to read. It was an accident. His new master's wife was a new wife, and she didn't have any experience with how slaves ought to be treated. And so she started to teach Frederick, along with the other children in the household, the alphabet. And her husband gave her a real dressing down and said, in Frederick's remembering, this is what her husband said: if you give a Negro an inch, he will take an L. An L, by the way, is the distance from your elbow to the tip of your fingers. It's about half a yard. This is an old form of, if you give him an inch, he'll take a yard. If you give a Negro an inch, he will take an L. A Negro should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best Negro in the world. Now, if you teach that Negro how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. Well, after this, Frederick said, this is the same autobiography, I was most narrowly watched. If I was in a separate room any considerable length of time, I was sure to be suspected of having a book, and was at once called to give an account of myself. All this, however, was too late. The first step had been taken. Mistress, in teaching me the alphabet, had given me the inch, and no precaution could prevent me from taking the L. The plan which I adopted, and the one by which I was most successful, was that of making friends of all the little white boys whom I met in the street. As many of these as I could, I converted into my teachers. With their kindly aid, obtained at different times and in different places, I finally succeeded in learning to read. When I was sent on errands, I always took my book with me, and by going one part of my errand quickly, I found time to get a lesson before my return. I used also to carry bread with me, enough of which was always in the house, and to which I was always welcome, for I was much better off in this regard than many of the poor white children in our neighborhood. This bread I used to bestow upon the hungry little urchins, who in return would give me that much more valuable bread of knowledge. Once he learned to read, he would occasionally sneak into his master's library and peruse in particular a book called The Columbian Orator, which was a collection of speeches going back to Greek and Roman times and going up into the early 19th century. Speeches by public figures, speeches mostly about social problems or philosophical issues, moral issues. And he'd read these speeches aloud. He was not only internalizing the content of the speeches, he was learning to be a public speaker. At age 14, he had the bad luck to be sent back to a plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland. And between the ages of 14 and 18, he had the worst experience of his life. And he wrote, "If at any one time in my life more than another I was made to drink the bitterest dregs of slavery, that time was during the first 6 months of my 4-year stay. We were worked in all weathers." This was a different plantation than before, and a different overseer. "We were worked in all weathers. It was never too hot or too cold. It could never rain, blow, hail, or snow too hard for us to work in the field. Work, work, work was scarcely more the order of the day than of the night. The longest days were too short for him, and the shortest nights too long. I was somewhat unmanageable when I first went there, but a few months of this discipline tamed me. The master succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, in soul, and in spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. My disposition to read disappeared. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man transformed into a brute." But at age 18, he lucked out again and was sent back to Baltimore, where he developed a trade. He became a caulker, Caulker, a caulker, someone who caulked the seams in wooden boats. He became a caulker at the shipyard, and every day he would go to work in the shipyard and then come home and turn his salary over to the master. He escaped 2 years later at age 20. He had met a free black woman named Anna Murray. He fell in love with her. On September 3rd, 1838, he was 20 years old. With some money from her, he bought a train ticket. He had a phony ID. black people, free black people, all carried with them letters attesting that they were free and not enslaved. And just the presence of the possession of the letter convinced people. They felt that an escaped slave could not possibly have written this himself because slaves were completely illiterate. He composed a letter testifying that he was freeborn. I think possibly she wrote it because her handwriting was probably better than his. Because he had the money, because he had this phony ID, basically, because he was well spoken, because he could go to the train station and read the schedule and sit on the bench reading a newspaper, he passed as a free black man. He got on a train and went to New York City, and a few days later, Anna Murray joined him, and they married and immediately got on another train and headed to New Bedford, Massachusetts. They spent the next 7 years of their lives in Massachusetts, 4 years in New Bedford, 3 years in Lynn. Those towns were Quaker towns. The Quakers were the first Protestant denomination to come out against slavery, to condemn slavery. They had done so in England, and of course they maintained that stance when they came to the U.S. And New Bedford and Lynn were both cities controlled by Quakers. In the case of New Bedford, Massachusetts then was probably the most, or possibly the most prosperous city in the nation because of all the wealth from the whaling industry. And many of these Quakers were ship owners, whaling ship owners. And Lynn also was a city controlled by Quakers. It was at the end of the 7 periods in Massachusetts that Frederick Douglass had become the Frederick Douglass of history books. Excuse me, I have to cough for a minute. Beginning with his name, he was still Frederick Bailey. And he was an escaped slave in New Bedford. And there were slave catchers. So he and Anna were living at a station on the Underground Railroad. This is a home in New Bedford run by 2 free blacks, Nathan and his wife, Mary Page Johnson. The Johnsons were fierce abolitionists, and he and Anna stayed with them a few months and then got their own place down the street. The home of the Johnsons is today a historic site. You can visit it. Nathan said, Frederick, you got to change your name. And Nathan at the time was reading a poem by Sir Walter Scott called Lady of the Lake, in which a couple of the principal characters were named Douglas. And Nathan suggested Douglas. And Frederick took that suggestion, and he added an extra S to the end because the free blacks in Maryland named Douglas spelled it with 2 S's at the end. So he became Frederick Douglass. The Johnsons were not Quakers. They were Universalists. Universalists were the first American Protestant denomination to denounce slavery. The whole Universalist denomination went on record as opposing slavery in 1794, which was very early. The Unitarian denomination, by the way, never went on record as opposing slavery, though of course individual ministers did. But 1794 is still 30 years before William Ellery Channing whispered a word against slavery in a sermon. The Johnsons were fierce abolitionists, and with their urging, Frederick began to speak at all black gatherings, all black anti-slavery gatherings. And the Johnsons also knew, of course, white abolitionists. They knew people in the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society headed by William Lloyd Garrison, whose paper, The Liberator, was an anti-slavery newspaper. And after 2 or 3 years of Frederick speaking at all-black gatherings, he was invited to an all-white gathering. This was in 1841 on Nantucket Island, 30 miles at sea. And he spoke for the first time to an all-white anti-slavery gathering. And this began an intense campaign of speaking to anti-slavery groups of both colors all over eastern New England, mostly in Massachusetts. It amuses me, and I'd like to share this, to read an account by a white man of what he thought of Frederick Douglass. Hingham is a tony town, suburb of Boston, right next to Weymouth, the blue-collar town where I served at church for many years. And the editor of the Hingham Patriot attended an anti-slavery gathering in Hingham at which Frederick spoke. And he said this in the newspaper. "Mr. Douglass is very fluent in the use of language," said the editor. "Choice and appropriate language, too, and talks as well, for all we could see, as men who have spent all their lives over books. He is forcible, keen, and very sarcastic. And considering the poor advantages he must have had as a slave, he is certainly a remarkable man." And of course, indeed, it was in 1845 that he published the autobiography that I've been reading from. And now there was a target on his back, right? He was speaking all over eastern New England. He's just published this autobiography with his new name, Frederick Douglass. Now he's got a target on his back. So to escape, he went to the British Isles, where he stayed for 2 years, till 1847. He went to England, Ireland, and Scotland on just a long series of speaking tours. And while he was there, 2 Quaker sisters, Ellen and Anne Richardson, this is in the year 1846, got in touch with his owner in Maryland and bought him. These Quakers raised the money to buy him. They paid $711.66 for Frederick Douglass in 1846. That's tens of thousands of dollars today. I don't know exactly how much, but tens of thousands of dollars today that they raised. So at last, in 1847, he was free. And he returned to the U.S. He may have stopped in New England, I don't know, but he quickly settled in Rochester, New York, another Quaker city, where he started his newspaper, the North Star, and he became the Frederick Douglass we read about. And I said later in life, he went to Washington, D.C. after the Civil War, where he worked in city government. If you go to Washington, D.C., you can see a very nice house that he lived in, which is a historical site. And he ended his career as a diplomat representing the United States to Haiti. Those are his accomplishments. I said there were 3 things I admired about him. His accomplishments. Secondly, the keenness of his mind. And I don't want this to go too long, so I'm just going to read one little thing about the keenness of his mind, but I find this really impressive. This is from an essay Douglass wrote in 1855. So now he's 37. It's an analysis of slavery, and it's analysis of the exploitation of whites by this anti-black racism. This is Frederick Douglass, 1855. The slaveholders, with a craftiness peculiar to themselves, by encouraging the enmity of the poor laboring white man against the blacks, succeeds in making the said white man almost as much a slave as the black slave himself. The difference between the white slave and the black slave is this: the black slave belongs to one slaveholder, and the white slave belongs to all the slaveholders collectively. The white slave has taken from him by indirection what the black slave has taken from him directly and without ceremony. But both are plundered, and by the same plunderers. The slave is robbed by his master of all his earnings, above what is required for his bare physical necessities, and the white slave is robbed by the slave system of the just results of his labor, because he is flung into competition with a class of laborers who work without wages. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Thirdly, I said I was impressed by his character. I can say briefly what I mean by that. Once he arrived in New Bedford, he had it made. He was in a Quaker-run town. He'd just changed his name to Frederick Douglass. He had a trade. There's a shipyard. He could be caulking boats in New Bedford, which is another seaport, just as well as in Baltimore. He had it made. But he started becoming a public speaker, right? He put a target on his back. He took that risk. In 1847, when he returned to the U.S. from his British Isles tour, he had it made. He was free. His freedom had just been purchased by those Quaker sisters. But he went to Rochester and became a publisher, and that was risky too. He was putting a target on his back again. In 1865, when slavery was over, he had it made. But he didn't rest. He spent the rest of his life not just fighting segregation, black-white issues, but he was a fighter for women's suffrage. He had been present in 1848 at that very first women's suffrage convention in Seneca Falls, New York. Frederick Douglass was there, and he was a fighter for women's suffrage. He fought segregation in churches, in schools, in public accommodations, in public transportation for the rest of his life. He never stopped fighting. I'd like to, referring to his fighting segregation in public transportation, let me tell just one quick anecdote. When he was in Lynn, Massachusetts, so this is back about 1843 or so. Lynn is very close to Boston, and it was a quick train ride, and he got on a train. He was going to Boston, and he was told by the conductor, as he had been told many times before, that he had to go to the black car, which is at the rear behind the luggage car. And as he had done many times before, he had refused and often had gotten away with it. But this time, the conductor summoned another railroad employee, and the two of them tried to lift Frederick out of his seat. But he was a big, strong man, and he hung on, and they couldn't get him out of his seat. So they unscrewed it from the floor and lifted the seat with Frederick still in it and carried it out onto the platform and set it down. He died on February 20th, 1895, at age 77, though he thought he was 78. And I'd like to close by reading something from the diary of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. He died on February 20th. On February 21st, Elizabeth Cady Stanton put in her diary, "Taking up the papers today, the first word that caught my eye thrilled my very soul. Frederick Douglass is dead. What memories of the long years since he and I first met chased each other thick and fast through my mind and held me spellbound. I remembered his burning eloquence before a Boston anti-slavery meeting, when, with wit, satire, and indignation, he graphically described the bitterness of slavery and the humiliation of subjection to people who, in all human virtues and powers, were inferior to himself. The first time I saw him, around him sat the great anti-slavery orators of the day, earnestly watching the effect of his eloquence on that immense audience that laughed and wept by turns, completely carried away by the wondrous gifts of his pathos and humor. For me, she wrote, all the other speakers seemed tame after Frederick Douglass. He stood there like an African prince, majestic in his wrath. I wondered that any mortal should have ever tried to subjugate a being with such talent and such love of liberty. We are a membership organization. We try not to waste your money. Our duty now is to provide UU congregations with something the UUA seems no longer capable of providing, namely sensible advice on matters of racial justice. Check us out. Consider becoming a member. And now, for closing music, I'd like to play by the same singers. Hymn number 100, I've got Peace Like a River.
I've got peace like a river, I've got peace like a river, I've got peace like a river in my soul. I've got peace like a river, I've got peace like a river, I've got peace like a river in my soul, in my soul. I've got joy like a fountain, I've got joy like a fountain, I've got joy like a fountain in
must be a religion that, like sunshine, goes everywhere. Its temple, all space. Its shrine, the good heart. Its creed, all truth. Its, what's the last one?
Ritual, works of love?
It's ritual, thank you, works of love. Thank you, thank you. That's Theodore Parker, the heroic abolitionist Unitarian minister. Though not, of course, without his prejudices. I hear he certainly was anti-Irish, probably anti-Semitic, but we can't all be perfect. The service is over. Now it's time for, if you're interested in having an open conversation that is talking about anything, let me end the recording. Let me end the recording so you won't feel inhibited.